Here's the presentation for Chapter 4, Key Issue 4. We're dealing with the question of why folk and popular cultures face sustainability challenges. And when we say sustainability, we're talking about the ability for them to continue to thrive. Let's talk about folk culture. Increased connection with popular culture makes maintaining centuries-old practices difficult. Now, inherent in this is the importance of isolation. And as the population level of the world continues to rapidly increase, you can imagine that the ability for any culture to remain isolated will become more and more difficult. The impacts of globalization on the landscape creates challenges in maintaining a unique landscape. As you see in that picture in the bottom right, you have KFC in a very different setting than what you might normally picture when you see KFC. It's the largest fast food chain in Africa, although most of those locations are in South Africa. But if you can imagine into the future, as more and more popular chains, show up in places like this, instead of women selling those fruits on the street, maybe in a few years there will be a grocery store next to KFC, maybe even a Kroger. I don't know. But the idea is that with globalization, the landscape becomes more uniform. And so anywhere you go will look more like the last place you were at, which is not a very exciting prospect for me, but it does mean greater convenience and arguably a better quality of life for more people. The global diffusion of popular culture beliefs has challenged the subservience of women to men that is embedded in some folk customs. And this, of course, is a good thing. When popular culture carries with it certain beliefs, like the belief that men and women are equal, and it carries that into a traditional culture, it gives more opportunities to women. Opportunities in education, opportunities in the workplace. And this is a good thing not only because it gives more choices to people, but it also helps the economy. If you've got half of the country's population, the female portion, who are not able to take part in business and education, not able to really play a large role in the economy, then you're really limiting your country. Let's look specifically at the Amish as one of our examples of folk culture and the challenges that they have in maintaining their way of life. Some Amish families have sold their land in Pennsylvania in recent years for two possible reasons. One, the sustainability of their way of life depends on isolation. So if there's too many people in the north and there's a growing number of tourists moving into their area to gawk at their way of life or learn about their way of life, that limits their level of isolation, right? And it connects them more with the outside world, which can pull more people away from their traditional values. So that's something that many of the Amish community want to avoid, and so they've moved to more rural places further from other American communities, so more into the country. And the tradition of every son getting a farm when he becomes an adult, it's very difficult to do in places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the price of land has been increasing. And so many have sold their land there and moved further south, like places in Kentucky, where they can purchase more land. So this map on the bottom right just shows a little bit of the spread of the Amish in the number of church districts per state. As you can see, the distribution of Amish is mostly in the Midwest and the Northeast, but the numbers have been increasing in the South, in the upper South, like Kentucky and Tennessee. On the left, you have a time lapse of a barn raising, which is a big event in Amish life where the whole community comes together, and usually these people are unpaid. They're just looking out for each other and all working together to build this barn for one of the farmers. And I can't think about the Amish without throwing in something from Weird Al's famous and infamous song, Amish Paradise. Now let's go to another example, and that of India. We talk about India a lot, in part because it's a very interesting place, but also because a big chunk of the world's population lives there. One of the impacts is changing gender roles, as we mentioned before. And obviously this is a positive thing. More women are getting education, more women are getting jobs. That is just one of the values in popular culture, that just about everybody should have the right to choose what they want to do. But there have been some very negative impacts. As countries like India, and what I'm going to talk about, we could include other countries like the Philippines and Thailand, Burma, a number of countries in Southeast Asia specifically. But as these places become more connected with the wider world, there's a very ugly side to that connection, which is an increase in human trafficking and prostitution. Human trafficking is often called modern-day slavery. This is the movement of people for the purposes of slave labor, but often for prostitution. So putting these people into sex trafficking. And they are either coerced, forced, or made to be addicted to certain drugs to the point at which they don't have power over themselves, and their handlers can then use them for prostitution to make money off of foreigners. And unfortunately, this has given rise to something known as sex tourism, where people from other countries, primarily Northern Europe and Southwest Asia, move into places like India and Thailand, the Philippines, Burma, among other countries, and they visit there just for prostitution because it may not be legal in their countries. And this, of course, makes many women into victims. Another downside of increased connection with popular culture are dowry murders. Now, dowry traditionally was a gift given to the family of the bride when a young man was trying to find someone's hand in marriage. But in the last century or so, that has flipped, and there's an expectation that the family of the bride is the one to give the gift to the family of the groom. And there are a number of possible reasons for this. One of them is that women have become seen, unfortunately, especially in countries with great population growth like India. They've been seen as a liability, that if you can't get rid of your daughter by marrying her off to someone, then you will be stuck with her, another mouth to feed. So this is a possible answer. Well, for whatever the reason that there is, in recent years, dowries the expectation has become less and less realistic about what dowries should be. At one time, a dowry may have been a goat, and now dowries can be cash, they could be technology, and the growing level of consumerism has led to greater expectation for gifts from the bride's family. In 2010, 8,391 brides were killed because the dowry that were given were not considered to be good enough. And it's really hard for us to wrap our head around how something like this could even happen. But as we saw in the documentary on population growth in India, the value put on human life in many societies where it seems like there are people everywhere you turn, and B, many people don't live past a young age. The value seems to be lower than in many other societies. And that's a blanket statement, and I certainly wouldn't want to put that on all the people of, for instance, India, because I don't believe that everyone there sees things that way. But for whatever reason, there is just unbelievable level of disrespect for young women, whether it is dowry deaths or bride burnings at the hands of mother-in-laws angry that their daughter-in-laws are not having children, whatever it may be. There's definitely a real problem, and there's obviously a connection here to this change in culture where people are starting to value material goods more than traditions and customs and family. We'll talk real quick about something called sequent occupants. It's just a fancy term, as many human geoterms are, that it really is a lot simpler than it may at first sound. It's the process by which a landscape is gradually transformed by a succession of occupying populations, each of which modifies the landscape left by previous groups. Basically meaning as different groups of people live in one particular area and societies change, one group will change the landscape in one way, and then years later another group will make their mark on the landscape. And you see two examples here, one the Agora in Athens, which is obviously from ancient Greece, and then surrounding it you have modern buildings. On the right you have the pyramids at Giza, and of course in the foreground you have some very modern, I think that's a hotel, and out to the left beyond that many simple modern buildings that people are living in. Here's an example of a picture that I took in France. This is in Lyon, France, one of the principal cities of that country. And in the foreground you have some Roman ruins. These are a series of Roman amphitheaters. In the background you have an 18th century church. And then to the left, and I guess kind of in the middle, you have some more modern buildings, probably just from the last couple decades. On the left you have some apartment buildings and then some office buildings as well. So you have really three distinct civilizations with their own values and their own style, and you can see how they've all left their mark on the land. And here is a quick breakdown of what sequent occupants of one particular area might look like or might have looked like. You have the indigens or explorer stage, minimal impact on the land. People may be doing a little bit of agriculture, mostly foraging and hunting. A few buildings being built, but again, not a very large population. The pioneer stage, you have a growing population, more agricultural usage of the land, a few more buildings being built, And then in the commercial agriculture or early industrial stage, you have agriculture on a large level, which means more of the land is going to be changed by humans. You have more buildings, you have a growing population, but you're also starting to pull resources from the earth, things like certain minerals, oil, coal, and metals that can then be used in factories. And then mid to late industrial and early tourism stage, you're seeing even more dominance over the land by human beings, but not as much likely or possibly not as much extraction of resources from the earth as you're doing more recycling of things like plastics and metals. And you're starting to have people growing concerned about what the environment looks like and what their impact on it is. The diffusion of some popular customs can adversely impact environmental quality in two ways. The first is the pollution of the landscape. Now, this doesn't just mean when someone throws trash on the ground, which obviously is a problem and does pollute the landscape, but it can be any kind of change that human beings make to the landscape. Sometimes it looks bad, sometimes it doesn't look bad. One example that I don't have a picture on here of is how uniform landscapes can be used to generate product recognition. Examples would be motels, fast food restaurants, and gas stations. And so you can be driving around any part of the United States and you will find areas of town that look like they could be anywhere, that look like they could be in any city. That's a uniform landscape. Another thing that contributes to the drastic change of environment would be a golf course. And this would be an example of something that, in my opinion, doesn't look bad. In fact, can look very pleasing to the eyes. But there can be negative environmental impacts using up too many resources, too much water in one area, or preventing water from going where it naturally would, and stuff like that. And on the left you have a depiction of a feedlot. This is where cows are taken in order to fatten them up before being slaughtered. And what was once likely a field of grass is now simply a bunch of mud and meat, or what will be meat. And another example from my own experience. This is a little small town in southwest France. I took this picture just this past summer. And I want you to imagine if some of our recognizable brands showed up here. Imagine McDonald's, buying one of these buildings and setting up their restaurant there. It really would start to ruin the experience and the sense of place that somewhere like this has. And you could imagine other brands popping up, TJ Maxx over in the corner, and BP gas station moving in. It would really change the landscape. Many would argue, myself included, for to the detriment of such a place, which was really an incredible location. And finally, just a little comparison, because I want us to consider that these cultures and these people's way of life sometimes change for the good as they become more developed, but not necessarily. So where would you rather be? Would you rather be in a rice paddy, a rice terrace, where rice is grown in these terraces, which are human-made, but have existed for hundreds of years, or in a simple, ugly strip mall where everywhere pretty much looks the same aside from different signage. I'm certainly not espousing one way or the other. I happen to enjoy the conveniences of modern life and popular culture, but it is food for thought. Let's look at some sustainability challenges for popular culture. Increased demand for the products of popular culture can strain the capacity of the environment. So we can change the landscape in a negative way, but we also can strain the availability of resources by using up too many of them. One example is with animals, and there's two things we can talk about here. Animal skins or animal features like horns can be met with demand for certain clothing products, especially animal skins. Popular culture may end up being better for species survival than folk culture. And your book doesn't say this, but I think it's something worth mentioning. Certainly, styles like the one that you see in these pictures contribute to declining populations of certain animals, and have in the past contributed to those animals being close to extinction. But it may be possible that popular culture, as its values begin to shift, as I believe they have in regards to animal furs, they could actually prevent many people who otherwise would have from wearing clothes that are made from animals. Now, much of the fashion is moving towards, I guess you could call it vegan clothing, clothing that doesn't use animals. So certainly fewer animal skins, and even fewer styles that even use things like wool, which don't technically maim animals, but can be uncomfortable, I suppose, for sheep. At least that's what PETA says. But what I'm saying here is that popular culture, as the values shift from one direction to another, could actually be a positive thing. And we want to keep that in mind. And I don't think this is the only example of that. But one of the primary concerns that people have is about meat. One of the problems that we face is that the calories we get from meat require much more energy to produce than the calories we may get from vegetables and grains. That is to say, because before you can eat an animal, it has to live a certain amount of time, and you have to feed it for that time. And so, if you're putting all that food into the animal, you could just be putting that food directly into your mouth, and you will never get the amount of calories from the animal that you put into the animal. And if you need to run that back and hear it again, feel free. Now, why is this a concern? This is a concern because more people are eating meat than ever before. As more countries and more people get wealthier and wealthier, they want to live like the wealthy. They want to eat meat. And if you look at this graph here, you'll see that meat consumption in China has risen dramatically since the 1980s. As China has been developing rapidly, more people have more money. They have greater access to industrial meat processes like the kind that we use here, and their meat consumption and production has increased to the point at which they produce and eat more meat than any other country in the world. Now, they still don't eat as much meat as we do per capita, that is to say per person. So it's very important to think about population when we're looking at something like this. Yeah, China eats a lot more meat than we do, but they also have a lot more people. But The problem with this is that as more and more people are eating meat, that's more and more strain on agriculture. Because again, to feed all those animals that you want to eat, you have to grow food for them. Another possible problem with this, way in which it's not sustainable, is that meat is worse for the environment than vegetables are. As you see here, it's showing how much CO2 each unit of food, whether it's lamb, beef, cheese, pork, salmon, dried beans, milk, tomatoes, tofu, lentils. It basically shows the carbon footprint of each of these types of food. And as you can see, the worst ones are lamb and beef, and the best ones are the different vegetables, nuts, and milk is not so bad. But chicken, turkey are also not so bad. So one of the things that people are going to likely have to do moving forward as our population level in the world increases and more people want to eat meat is to eat meats that aren't quite so bad for the environment, that don't require quite so much energy to produce, things like chicken and fish, which I believe that our own country has begun shifting to, as more people are eating chicken than beef than ever before. But we talk about this because meat is an element of popular culture. Now, it might be plateauing. People are not eating as much as they have in the past, which is probably a good thing. But it is still very much something that people want to be able to do as they adopt popular culture. They want to eat a McDonald's hamburger. They want to have barbecue. They want to eat a chicken sandwich. Now, another challenge for sustainability is consumerism. And this goes hand in hand with globalization. It goes hand in hand with popular culture. I define consumerism as the continued acquisition and discarding of manufactured goods, and that results in massive waste. Should say goods that results in massive waste, meaning people are always getting new things and getting rid of their old things. I know I've been guilty of this. I've got a collection of cell phones that probably could still work, even though they don't work great, but I've moved on to newer and better ones. But this is a part of our culture, especially with advertising and the need to always be at the cutting edge of technology. People feel like they have to have the newest phone, even though the one they got last year works just fine. iPhone X is out, and people are waited in line just to get the new one, even though theirs was probably just fine. Well, this has resulted in an unbelievable amount of waste, and it's not just with technology. Much of the technology that we discard can be recycled, but plastic bags and plastic bottles are not always recycled and end up, of course, having to go somewhere. And they might not go here, they might go over to other countries who are paid to basically take our trash. But as, again, population levels increase, we can see this becoming a worse and worse problem, especially as more cultures around the world want to adapt our way of life, which is a very consumeristic approach. Good news is that recycling in the United States has been on an upward trajectory, and our level of waste has plateaued and is even slightly declining in the last few years. We do a lot of recycling of plastic and a lot of recycling of metals, and are really the world leader in recycling of steel especially. Lastly, I want to talk about sustainability issues with folk culture, because even though your book doesn't touch on this very much, there are some practices associated with different folk cultures which are harmful to the environment. One of those is poaching. Now, it's not necessarily folk cultures that do the poaching, but they may drive up the demand. Demand for rhino horns is greatest in Asian countries that use them for traditional Chinese medicine and as a status symbol to display wealth. So that can have a negative impact on species survival. And then we can talk about agricultural practices as well. Without the modern knowledge and tools associated with today's agriculture, many folk cultures practice something known as slash and burn agriculture, where they will burn down and cut down huge swaths of forest and use that cleared land for agriculture. And then once they deplete the nutrients of that soil, they will move on to another parcel of land and burn down another section of the forest. And this results in huge areas of deforestation, which we know releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and of course removes those trees that were helping to remove that carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. And all of this can contribute to global warming and obviously a number of other, well, not obviously, but a number of other negative environmental concerns. So popular culture is definitely responsible for some negative things going on in the world. But as we have mentioned before, if the values can be adjusted such that people are concerned about others, not just themselves, then popular culture can serve to get people on the same page about issues and can serve to get them to think about the impact they'll have on other people in the world and also future generations. And I think that is where popular culture can make a shift from being negative in its consumerism and in its waste and in its opulence to being positive in that it gets people working together as a team. Well, that's all. That's the end. Again, if you have any questions, send them to me or bring them to class.